The morning Evelyn Carter fired Daniel Hayes, the air conditioning in the conference room was set 3 degrees too cold, and nobody said a word about it. She had walked in at exactly 8:59, 1 minute before the all-hands meeting was scheduled to begin, her navy blazer pressed with the kind of precision that suggested it had never encountered a wrinkle in its life. The room held 42 people, department heads along the walls. Junior engineers packed into the rear rows, the company's legal counsel seated quietly near the exit, as if he had anticipated needing a quick departure. Evelyn set her folder on the podium, adjusted the microphone once, and looked out at the assembled faces of Arcturus Technologies. Then she looked at Daniel Hayes, slumped in a chair in the third row, chin dipped toward his chest, eyes closed, completely and utterly asleep. She picked up the folder and brought it down against the surface of the podium, with a crack that bounced off every wall in the room. Daniel's head snapped up. 41 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Evelyn's voice, when it came, was even, measured, and absolute. "Daniel Hayes," she said, "you are terminated, effective immediately." The room went still in the way that rooms only go still when something irreversible has just been said out loud. Daniel Hayes looked at her for a moment. He did not blink rapidly, the way startled men sometimes do. He did not look around the room, seeking allies or witnesses. He simply looked at Evelyn Carter, with dark, steady eyes that gave away nothing, then reached forward, took the termination form that the HR director had placed on the seat beside him, as though it had been waiting there for exactly this moment, uncapped a pen, and signed his name. He stood, buttoned the middle button of his jacket, and walked out of the conference room without speaking a single word to anyone. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. 3 seconds of total silence followed. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, someone's phone buzzed against the table, and the world resumed. Evelyn Carter had been CEO of Arcturus Technologies for 18 months and 4 days when she made that decision. She had taken the role during a period of rapid expansion, the kind that looks effortless from the outside and feels like controlled chaos from within, and she had done what she was hired to do. She streamlined the management structure. She cut the bottom 15% of underperforming product lines. She rebuilt the company's go-to-market strategy from the ground up and, within 11 months, increased quarterly revenue by 31%. The board adored her. Industry publications called her one of the most decisive technology executives of her generation. She was 41 years old, had never been married, kept a minimalist apartment 12 floors above the city, and woke every morning at 5:15 without an alarm. She had built her entire philosophy around a single principle. Discipline is the architecture of success. Not talent, not luck, not inspiration arriving at 3 in the morning like a benevolent ghost. Discipline. Consistency. The willingness to hold every person, including yourself, to an identical standard, without exception and without sentimentality. It was a worldview she had earned the hard way, built out of years of watching talented people waste themselves on bad habits and excuses, and she wore it not like armor, but like skin. It was simply who she was. The staff at Arcturus respected her the way people respect things that are powerful and slightly unpredictable. They arrived on time. They prepared their reports with rigor. They did not take extended lunches or show up to strategy sessions without having reviewed the materials. Productivity metrics improved across every division within her first 6 months. Turnover was down. Execution timelines were tighter. The company, by nearly every measurable indicator, was performing better under Evelyn Carter than it had in the 5 years before her arrival. And yet there was, embedded within this well-run machine, a persistent anomaly, a variable that refused to behave like a variable. A man who slept at his desk, disappeared from meetings, wandered the server room at 2 in the morning, and somehow, inexplicably, continued to be responsible for the most sophisticated artificial intelligence infrastructure the company had ever produced. That man was Daniel Hayes. And for 18 months, Evelyn Carter had been watching him, weighing him, and deciding what to do about him. His file was, in the clinical language of corporate documentation, extraordinary. He had joined Arcturus 9 years earlier. arriving with 3 advanced degrees and a portfolio of patent filings that the company's legal team had needed 6 weeks to fully inventory. In the years since, he had designed the core architecture of what was now the company's flagship AI platform, a system that processed client data, generated predictive analytics, and powered the decision-making tools that accounted for roughly 62% of Arcturus's total revenue. He had written code that no other engineer on staff fully understood. He had, on at least 4 documented occasions, predicted critical system failures weeks before the monitoring software flagged any anomaly. The previous CEO had described him in a board presentation as the kind of person who appears once in a generation, if you're lucky. 3 competitor firms had attempted to recruit him, one of them offering a compensation package that reportedly began with a number followed by 7 zeros. He had declined all of them. He stayed at Arcturus. He stayed, and he slept at his desk. And he vanished for hours without explanation, and he woke from his brief collapses with no apology and no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred, as though the gap in consciousness had simply been a pause between sentences, easily stepped over and forgotten. The staff talked about Daniel in the way that people talk about phenomena they cannot fully explain, not with contempt, not quite with awe, but with the particular uncertainty reserved for things that fall outside the normal categories. He had worked at Arcturus for 9 years, and in that time had become, depending on who you asked, either the most valuable person in the building or the most baffling one. Junior engineers who had studied his code described the experience in terms that were closer to literary criticism than technical analysis. They spoke about logic structures that revealed new layers, the more you looked at them, about design choices that seemed arbitrary until you understood the context 3 levels down, at which point they revealed themselves to be the only sensible option. One engineer, 2 years out of a top graduate program and proud of it, had spent 3 days trying to understand a single module in the platform's data routing layer before concluding, with more humility than he had arrived with, that he would need to understand everything else first. Daniel, when asked about it, had explained it in 12 minutes on a whiteboard. And when the engineer said he still didn't fully follow, Daniel had erased the board and drawn it again from a different angle, which took 9 minutes. And then it was clear. The engineer had stood there afterward, looking at the board, and said nothing for a long time. He later described it as the most educational 9 minutes of his professional life, and he kept the photo he had taken of the whiteboard on his phone for the rest of the year, pulling it out occasionally, the way people pull out things that remind them that the world is larger than their current understanding of it. For the first year of her tenure, Evelyn had tolerated it. She had told herself that exceptional performance warranted individual consideration, that the data on Daniel's contributions was too compelling to disrupt with a disciplinary action that might cause him to leave. She had told herself this, and she had believed it, and she had allowed it. But there are limits to the stories. Even the most pragmatic people tell themselves, and Evelyn Carter reached hers on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd quarter, during a cross-departmental strategy session that had taken 3 weeks to schedule. Every division head was present. The presentation covered the company's 18-month product roadmap decisions that would shape the direction of Arcturus through the following fiscal year. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most consequential internal meeting of the quarter, and 20 minutes into it, Daniel Hayes had fallen asleep, not nodded off gently. The way exhausted people sometimes drift at the edges of attention. He had gone fully under, breathing visibly, head tilted back against the headrest of his chair, in front of 42 colleagues, and every senior leader the company employed. Evelyn had stood at the front of the room, looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and made a decision. She pulled him aside after the meeting. She did it without raising her voice. She never raised her voice. And she did not use the kind of language that humiliates. She was direct and clinical. She told him that falling asleep in a company-wide strategy session was unacceptable. She told him that his technical contributions, however significant, did not grant him exemption from basic professional conduct. She told him that other employees were watching him, and that what they observed set precedents whether anyone intended it or not. She told him all of this clearly, in a private conference room with the door closed and no audience. And when she finished, Daniel Hayes looked at her steadily and said, "I understand. I apologize." He said nothing else. He did not explain why he had fallen asleep. He did not mention that he had been awake for the previous 31 hours, resolving a cascading failure in the secondary data processing cluster, a failure that the monitoring system had not yet detected and would not detect for another 2 days. He simply apologized, stood, and returned to his work. Evelyn had watched him go and felt, not satisfaction exactly, but the clean certainty that she had done the right thing. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Not at a meeting this time in the hallway, outside the break room, standing upright, coffee cup in hand, eyes closed, completely still. One of the junior engineers had photographed it on her phone and shown it to 3 colleagues before someone had the sense to ask her to delete it. Evelyn had called him in again. He apologized again. She told him the next step would be formal performance documentation. He nodded. He went back to his desk. The HR director, a careful man named Marcus Webb, who had been with the company for 11 years, had come to Evelyn's office that afternoon and closed the door. He told her that the monitoring data he had been compiling at her request told an unusual story. Daniel Hayes was, by any measurable output metric, the highest performing technical employee at the company by a factor that was not close. He reviewed more code per week than the next 3 engineers combined. His response time on critical incidents was faster than any automated alert system the company operated. He had, in the past 6 months, filed 2 patent applications, mentored 4 junior engineers through their first major deployments, and redesigned a legacy data pipeline that had been a known inefficiency for 4 years. He was also, Marcus said carefully, sleeping in the building more nights than not, typically in the server room, occasionally at his desk, sometimes in an unused equipment closet on the 4th floor. Every morning he appeared at his workstation, clean, professional, and apparently ready to work. Marcus Webb placed a printed summary on Evelyn's desk, stood quietly for a moment, and said, "I just thought you should have the full picture." Evelyn thanked him, filed the report, and sat with it. The board meeting was 3 days later. 2 members argued for retaining Daniel, regardless of conduct concerns. One argued that no employee, regardless of output, should be permitted to operate outside the company's behavioral standards. Evelyn listened to both sides with equal attention and voted with neither. She said she would handle it. What she meant, though she did not say it aloud, was that she would wait for the next incident, and when it came, she would act. She did not have to wait long. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. It was an operational review, nothing especially sensitive, nothing that required Daniel's specific expertise. He was invited as a department attendee, not a presenter. He sat in the 3rd row, and somewhere between the financial summary and the product roadmap update, his body simply gave out, the way it had been giving out with increasing frequency, and he slept. And Evelyn Carter brought the folder down on the podium and said the words she had already decided to say, and Daniel Hayes signed the form and walked out, and that was that. Or at least, that was what Evelyn believed at the time. The first indication that something was wrong came 48 hours after Daniel's departure. It was subtle. A 2-second lag in the platform's real-time analytics processing, the kind of delay that most users wouldn't notice and that most monitoring systems would attribute to routine traffic variation. The on-call engineer logged it, flagged it as low priority, and moved on. The next morning there were 3 more anomalies, slightly larger, affecting different subsystems. By the afternoon, the platform's automated error logging had generated more than 800 entries, still within the range that the system was designed to handle. But higher than usual, high enough that the engineering lead, a sharp woman named Patricia Okafor, who had been with the company 6 years, looked at the pattern and felt something cold settle in her chest. She called her team together. She told them to pull the logs from the past 72 hours and map them against the system's dependency architecture. It took 4 hours. At the end of it, she had the answer she had been hoping not to find. The anomalies were not random. They were cascading outward from a specific set of interdependent modules, modules that formed the structural core of the platform, modules that no one on her team could describe the internal logic of with any confidence, because those modules had been written by a single person over the course of 9 years, in a layered, self-referencing style that presupposed a level of architectural familiarity that no one at Arcturus currently possessed. Patricia Okafor sent Evelyn an email at 11:47 that night. The subject line was 3 words. "We have a problem." The AI platform processed requests for over 200 enterprise clients. Contracts totaling more than $400 million annually. Applications that drove clinical decision support tools, financial risk assessment systems, supply chain optimization engines infrastructure that real organizations depended on for real operational outcomes. When the platform's primary processing layer failed on the following Tuesday morning, it failed without warning and completely. Client dashboards went dark. API calls returned null responses. 3 clients in the healthcare sector, whose systems relied on Arcturus's analytics for scheduling and resource allocation, activated emergency protocols. The company's investor relations phone lines lit up within 90 minutes. By early afternoon, Arcturus's stock had dropped 11%. By end of day, the number was 17. A senior account manager who had been with the company 8 years sat in his office and stared at his email inbox and could not think of a single reassuring thing to say to anyone. Evelyn Carter spent 15 hours in the building that day. She assembled an emergency response team. She authorized an immediate contract with an external AI consultancy whose senior engineers had decades of experience between them. She authorized a second contract with a cybersecurity firm to rule out external interference. She told her communications team to draft client notices that were honest, measured, and did not speculate. She did all the right things, all the executive things, all the things that a decisive, disciplined CEO does in a crisis. None of them worked. The external consultants arrived the next morning. They were experienced, credentialed, and thorough. They spent 18 hours reviewing the system's codebase. At the end of it, their lead engineer asked to speak with Evelyn privately. He was a tall, weathered man, with reading glasses permanently perched on top of his head. And he spoke in the measured tone of someone who has learned to deliver difficult assessments without flinching. He told her that the architecture they had been reviewing was unlike anything he had encountered in 30 years of systems work. It was not simply sophisticated, it was, in his word, generational. It had been designed not as a static system, but as a living one. With self-monitoring loops built into the base layer, error correction protocols nested inside error correction protocols, redundancy mechanisms so deeply embedded in the structure that they were invisible until you knew exactly where to look. The problem, he said, was that the entire system operated on a logic that presupposed intimate knowledge of itself. It was not designed to be maintained by a team. It was designed to be maintained by one person who understood it the way a composer understands a score, not note by note, but as a complete, living whole. Without that person, the system would not collapse immediately. It would degrade. Slowly at first, then faster. The errors they were seeing were not bugs. They were symptoms of a structure that was losing the single thread of understanding that had held it together. He paused, looked at Evelyn across the conference table, and said, "The person who built this was operating several years ahead of the rest of the industry. Whoever they are, you need them back." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then she asked him to write that up and send it to her in the next hour. He nodded and left the room. She sat alone in the conference room for 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than she usually sat still without a task in front of her. Marcus Webb was the one who found the files. Not because he was looking for them specifically, but because Daniel's system access had never been fully revoked, a procedural oversight that was itself revealing, as though even the administrative machinery of the company had somehow sensed that his departure was not entirely final. In the process of completing the access termination checklist, Marcus opened a shared drive folder that Daniel had never mentioned in any handover documentation, a folder labeled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone, except, presumably, the person who had created it. Inside were 4 years of technical journals, not the formal documentation that all senior engineers were required to maintain, but personal notes. Detailed, exhaustive, chronological. Code diagrams, with handwritten annotations in the margins. Architecture maps drawn in a style that was somewhere between engineering schematic and visual art. And, nested within a subfolder, marked with the word personal, a document that Marcus almost closed without reading, and then read in its entirety, sitting alone at his desk at 9 in the evening with the office nearly empty around him. He called Evelyn at 9:43 and told her she needed to come in. The document was not a confession. It was not a letter addressed to anyone. It was a medical log, the kind a meticulous person keeps when they have been dealing with a complex, chronic condition for long enough that documentation has become second nature. Daniel Hayes had been diagnosed 6 years earlier with a rare neurological condition affecting his sleep architecture. The specifics were technical and precise. He had written them in the same voice he used to write engineering notes, which was to say clearly, without sentiment, and with an attention to detail that made the account both entirely legible and quietly devastating. His brain operated, his neurologist had explained, at an unusually high metabolic rate. The elevated cognitive activity that had made him capable of designing systems that other engineers could not replicate also made sustained wakefulness physiologically costly in a way that was simply not comparable to normal human fatigue. He experienced episodes of sudden sleep onset, not narcolepsy exactly, but adjacent to it, that were unpredictable in their timing and impossible to fully suppress without pharmaceutical interventions that degraded the very cognitive capacity he depended on for his work. His doctor had told him, plainly and on multiple occasions, that he needed a structured schedule, that he needed to limit his working hours, and that continuing to push through episodes of sleep deprivation would accelerate the frequency and severity of the collapses. He had acknowledged all of this. He had thanked his doctor for her candor, and he had continued to come to work, continued to sleep in the server room and the equipment closet and at his desk, because he had also written, in a section of the document dated 3 years earlier, a paragraph that Evelyn read 3 times before she set the pages down. He had written, "The system is not stable without continuous oversight. The modular interdependencies I've built require active monitoring to catch edge case failures before they propagate. I can document them. I have been documenting them, but documentation is not the same as understanding, and no one on the team currently has the depth of context to act on the documentation correctly. I know what leaving would mean. I have modeled it. A transition of this architecture, done properly, would require a minimum of 18 months of intensive knowledge transfer, possibly 24. If I leave before that transfer is complete, the system will begin to fail within weeks of my departure. I cannot leave. Not yet. I know I cannot leave. So I sleep when I can. I sleep where I can. And I stay." He had been fired before the transfer was complete. He had been fired because he fell asleep in a meeting which he had done because he had been awake the previous night. In the server room, running diagnostics on a developing fault in the data ingestion pipeline, a fault he had identified and resolved by 3 in the morning, a fault that no monitoring system had detected, and that, had it propagated uncorrected, would have caused the kind of cascading failure that was now, 7 days after his departure, unfolding in real time across the company's entire platform. There was more in the files, logs of incidents. He had resolved at 2 in the morning, at 4 in the morning, on weekends, on holidays, on a Tuesday night when the building had been empty, and the city outside had been dark and quiet, and Daniel Hayes had been sitting on the floor of the server room with his laptop balanced on his knees, fixing something that no one else knew was broken. The log entries were brief and technical timestamps, error codes, resolution methods, but the cumulative effect of reading them in sequence was something else. There had been a Sunday morning in February, 3 years prior, when a cascade failure in the authentication system had begun propagating through the platform's core at 5:43 in the morning. The monitoring system had not yet triggered an alert. Daniel had detected it through a habit he described in his notes as ambient listening. a practice of running passive diagnostic queries on his personal terminal, even when he was not actively working, so that significant fluctuations would catch his attention before they reached critical thresholds. He had resolved the failure entirely by 8/21, logged it as routine maintenance in the company's internal ticketing system, and was at his desk with a coffee when the first employees arrived Monday morning. No one had known. The clients had not experienced a single second of degradation. There had been a Friday evening in autumn when a data integrity issue in the analytics pipeline had threatened to corrupt 6 weeks of historical records for a major financial client records that represented the basis of the client's quarterly risk model and whose loss would have triggered significant contractual liability. Daniel had spent 11 hours reconstructing the affected data using backup schemas he had built into the system's base layer, specifically for situations like this, situations that everyone assumed would never occur and that he had spent years quietly preparing for. He had sent the client their usual Monday morning report on schedule. There was an entry from a December holiday period, when the office had been closed for 5 days and Daniel had stayed in the city while everyone else traveled, spending the empty days doing what he called in his notes, deep maintenance, reviewing the system's entire dependency map, updating the self-monitoring protocols, reinforcing the structural elements most likely to develop stress fractures under the load patterns he had been observing in the preceding months. He had not told anyone he was doing this. He had not asked to be compensated for the time. He had simply done it because it needed to be done, and he was the only person who knew how, and because the alternative, leaving and coming back to find things broken, was not something he was willing to accept. There was a message from a competitor's recruiter, offering a base compensation of $9 million annually, plus equity. Daniel's response had been 3 sentences. He had thanked them for the offer, said he was not available, and said he hoped to reconnect at a future point. There was no explanation of why he had declined. There didn't need to be. Evelyn had read the documents in sequence, and by the time she reached the end, she understood the shape of the thing she had done. She did not go home that night. She sat in the conference room until 2 in the morning, going through the files a second time, and then a third, looking for something she might have missed, some detail that might reframe the conclusion she had reached, some evidence that she had been working with information that Daniel had concealed from her, and that his silence had therefore been a form of deception. She looked for it carefully and found nothing of the kind. He had not disclosed his medical condition, which was his legal right and arguably his only act of self-protection in an otherwise extraordinary series of sacrifices. He had not explained why he slept at the company. He had simply slept there and worked there and fixed things there that no one else knew were breaking. And when she had told him in front of 42 colleagues that he was fired, he had signed his name and walked out because there was, in the end, no response to what she had done that would have been adequate. She put the documents back in order, stacked them neatly on the conference table, and sat for a moment in the silence of the empty building. She realized, going to have to find him. It took 2 days. She started with the address in his HR file, a 2-room apartment in a quiet part of the city, close to a hospital, where she later learned he had a standing monthly appointment with his neurologist. The apartment was unlocked when she arrived, not because he had been careless, but because he had moved out 3 weeks after leaving Arcturus, taking only what fit in 2 bags. A neighbor, an elderly woman who had apparently developed a warm regard for the quiet young man who had lived there, told Evelyn that he had gone somewhere smaller and that he had left without much ceremony. She tried 3 coffee shops in the neighborhood before she found someone who knew him by name. He had apparently spent several afternoons there in the weeks since his departure, sitting at a corner table, working on something on his laptop, occasionally sleeping briefly with his head on his arms the way children sleep, without embarrassment or self-consciousness. The barista described him as polite and extremely good at tipping. A former colleague, a young engineer named Theo, who had worked under Daniel for 2 years and who now looked, when Evelyn appeared at his desk, as though he wanted very much to be elsewhere, eventually told her, with visible reluctance, that Daniel had been staying in a furnished room near the university district, about 20 minutes from the office. Because it was close to the library and close to the hospital, and because the rent was, he said carefully, manageable. She found him at a small park 2 blocks from the rooming house, sitting on a bench with a paperback book open on his knee and his eyes closed, though whether he was sleeping or simply resting was difficult to determine from a distance. She sat down on the other end of the bench. He opened his eyes. He looked at her with the same steady, unrevealing expression he had worn when she fired him. She said she had read his files. He said nothing. She said she understood now what he had been doing, and why, and she said it plainly, without embellishment, because that was the only kind of language she knew how to use when she was being honest. He was quiet for a while. A pigeon walked in a small circle near their feet, with great self-importance. Daniel said, "I should have documented the system more thoroughly. That's on me." Evelyn said, "That is not what's on you." He looked at her. She said, "I want you to come back." He closed it. He closed the book. He looked at the pigeons for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "No." She asked him to reconsider. He said the same word again. She said the company was in crisis. He said he knew. She asked how he knew, and he said that Patricia Okafor had been sending him technical questions by email for 4 days, which he had been answering because he did not want clients to suffer for a decision that was not their doing, but that answering questions remotely was not the same as being there. And he was not going back. She asked why. He said, "It's too late." And what he meant by that she was not entirely certain, but she sat with it rather than pressing. And after a moment she thanked him and stood. And he said, "Evelyn." She turned around. He said, "Whatever you decide about the system, get someone to sit with the documentation I left. All of it. Give them 6 weeks with nothing else to do. It'll take that long." She nodded. She walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes without starting the engine. The meeting she called the following Monday was unlike any Arcturus Technologies had ever held. She did not have a slide deck. She stood at the front of the room, the same conference room, the same podium, the same 42 people minus one, and she spoke for 23 minutes without notes. She told them about Daniel's medical condition. She told them about the files Marcus had found. She told them about the incidents he had resolved alone in the middle of the night, the meetings he had attended after staying awake for 30 hours, the recruiter's offer he had declined without explanation. She told them about the man sitting on a park bench with a paperback and a neurological condition that made sustained wakefulness physiologically costly, who had spent 9 years sleeping on the floor of their server room because he knew that if he left, the thing he had built would begin to break, and he could not let that happen to the people who depended on it. She said, "I made a decision based on what I could see, and I didn't look hard enough to see what was there." She said it without hedging, and without the kind of language that manages accountability while minimizing it. The room was very quiet. Several people were looking at the table. Patricia Okafor was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, but that contained, somewhere in it, relief. The head of product, a man who had argued at the board meeting for retaining Daniel, looked out the window. No one spoke for a long moment after she finished. Then, from somewhere near the back, someone's phone buzzed against the table. No one looked at it. The platform reached critical failure at 4:17 that afternoon, not in the way anyone had predicted, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a sequence of compounding errors that the external consultants had been watching accumulate for days and had not been able to stop, because stopping it required understanding the system's internal logic in a way that no amount of external expertise could substitute for. Client-facing systems began returning corrupted data. The healthcare clients activated their contingency protocols for the second time in a week. The financial risk clients suspended their live API integrations. The situation was, in the language of technology operations, a full severity incident, and the company had, by the consensus of everyone who looked at it, approximately 6 hours before the data corruption reached a depth from which recovery would require months. Patricia Okafor was at the server cluster when Daniel Hayes walked through the building's front entrance. No one had called him. No one had asked him to come. He had read Patricia's last email, done the calculation, and gotten in a cab. He was wearing a gray jacket over a dark shirt and carrying the same laptop bag he had taken when he left 2 weeks earlier, and he walked directly to the engineering floor without stopping at reception or acknowledging the 4 people who looked up from their desks and stared at him as he passed. He sat down at an empty workstation, opened his laptop, typed a command sequence that produced 11 screens of output that no one else in the room could parse, and said to Patricia, quietly, "How long do we have?" She told him. He said, "Get me your 3 best engineers and a coffee." She said, "We don't have your access credentials anymore." He said, "I have mine." He had never used a company-issued credential. He had, from the beginning, built the system with his own authentication layer, embedded inside the architecture not because he was protecting himself, but because it was cleaner, and because he had always known, on some level, that there might come a time when the only way to reach the core of the system quickly was through a pathway that did not depend on anyone else's approval. He logged in. The system recognized him the way a complicated machine recognizes the hands that built it. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Patricia's 3 engineers sat with him, watching the commands scroll across his screen, understanding maybe 40% of what they were seeing and asking questions about the rest, which he answered while typing. In the short, precise way of someone who has explained complex things to intelligent people many times and knows how to do it efficiently. He stopped twice, once to drink his coffee. Once, briefly, to close his eyes for 3 minutes while a process ran. No one said anything during those 3 minutes. At 8:37 in the evening, the platform's status indicator turned from red to yellow. At 9:12, it turned green. Client systems began responding normally. The API calls returned valid data. The monitoring logs went quiet. Patricia Okafor looked at the screens for a long moment, then looked at Daniel and said, "Thank you." He said, "Update the documentation I left in the shared drive. There's a new section at the bottom. Make sure someone reads it before they touch anything else." He closed his laptop and stood. Patricia said, "Daniel," and stopped, because she wasn't sure what she wanted to say, and then she said, "I read your journals. The ones Marcus found." He said nothing. She said, "I didn't know." He said, "Most people didn't." He picked up his bag. She said, "You came back anyway." He said, "The clients didn't do anything wrong." He nodded at the 3 engineers, who looked at him the way people look at things they are still in the process of understanding. And then he walked toward the exit. He almost made it. Evelyn was standing in the hallway outside the engineering floor. She had been there for approximately 2 hours, watching through the glass, not entering, not interrupting a discipline she had practiced in her own way, the discipline of restraint. When he came through the door, she was there. He stopped. She said, "I want to apologize. Formally. In front of everyone, if you'll allow it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know I don't have to." He looked at her in that steady, unreadable way of his and said, "Evelyn, I don't need the apology." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I just needed someone to actually look." She said, "I know." A long pause. The building hummed faintly around them, servers and cooling systems, and the quiet machinery of an organization that had, by a margin of 37 minutes, avoided catastrophe. Daniel said, "The knowledge transfer is going to take about 18 months if you do it properly. You need to find 2 engineers who can commit full-time to working through the documentation with me. No other projects. I'll need to come in 3 days a week." She said, "I'll give you 4. Your own schedule, your own office, with a couch." He looked at her. She said, "For the sleep." A pause. He said, "I'm not coming back as an employee." She said, "Senior strategic advisor, your terms." Another pause, longer than the first. Daniel Hayes looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way that people look at things that are not really on the ceiling. Then he said, "Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays." I keep my remote access. And I want Patricia on the core transition team, Evelyn said. Done. He nodded once and started down the hall toward the elevator. She called after him. He paused. She said, "Why did you come tonight?" He didn't turn around. He said, "Same reason I always came." The elevator doors opened. He stepped in, they closed. The formal apology happened 3 days later, at a company-wide meeting that Evelyn had called without explanation in advance. She stood at the podium in the same room, in front of the same 41 people. And she said what she had come to say with the same precision she brought to everything, but without the armor of certainty that had always accompanied it before. She told them that she had fired a man for a symptom of a condition he had not disclosed, which was his right, and that she had done it without looking closely enough at what he was doing and why he was doing it, and that her failure was not a failure of information. The information had been available, but a failure of the question she had been asking. She had been asking whether Daniel Hayes was compliant. She had not been asking what Daniel Hayes was holding together. She said that she was not standing there to perform contrition because she did not believe public contrition was a useful thing, but to acknowledge, plainly, that the standards she set were meaningless if she did not apply them to herself with the same rigor she applied them to others, and that she had fallen short of her own standard. She said the company would be changing the way it evaluated individual contribution building and processes for understanding not just output metrics but the conditions under which people produced their work, the constraints they operated under, the circumstances that shaped how they showed up. She said this was not a softening of accountability. She said it was a more precise form of it. The room listened. When she finished, there was no applause. People simply sat with what they had heard, which Evelyn suspected was the right response. And she was glad for the absence of theater. Daniel arrived the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning, signed in at the front desk, and walked up to the 4th floor, where a small office had been prepared for him, a proper office this time, not a corner of the engineering floor, with a desk and a window that faced east and a low couch against the interior wall that was not mentioned in any official paperwork anywhere. Patricia Okafor met him in the hallway with 2 coffees and a printed copy of the System Documentation Index. He said, "How much of this do you already understand?" She said, "Maybe 60%. He said, "Better than I expected." She said, "We had 4 days of nothing to do but read it." He said, "That's what it takes." They walked into the office together, and Patricia closed the door, and the work of understanding began. The knowledge transfer was not a glamorous undertaking. It was, in fact, one of the least glamorous things the engineering team had ever attempted. Slow, repetitive, often frustrating, and occasionally humbling in ways that experienced engineers do not particularly enjoy being humbled. James Park came into it with 14 years of systems architecture experience and left the first week's sessions feeling as though he was looking at a photograph through glass that was gradually becoming transparent. Sonia Reyes, who was younger and had less to unlearn, made faster initial progress and then hit a conceptual wall on the 3rd week that she spent 4 days walking around the edge of before finding the angle that led her through. Daniel was not an impatient teacher, but he was a precise one. He did not soften explanations or allow approximate understanding to pass as the real thing. If someone nodded at an explanation before they had actually absorbed it, he knew, and he said so. Not unkindly, but unambiguously, and went back to the beginning of the relevant section and found a different path through it. He had, it turned out, been thinking about how to teach this material for years. The documentation he had left was not simply a technical record, but a pedagogical one, structured in the order that made comprehension accumulate most efficiently, with annotations that pointed to the non-obvious connections and flagged the places where most readers' intuitions would lead them in the wrong direction. He had written it knowing on some level that someone would eventually need to read it without him there to explain it, and he had tried to make it as close to his own presence as a document could be. It was not quite the same thing, but it was close enough that after 8 weeks of daily work, James Park could sit in front of the core architecture and trace the logic of its major systems from end to end without losing the thread. and Sonia Reyes had begun identifying edge case scenarios that had not previously been on anyone's radar, which Daniel told her, with something that might have been satisfaction, was exactly the right kind of thinking. The months that followed were quiet, in the way that recovery is quiet, not peaceful, but deliberate, with the particular quality of effort that comes when people have looked directly at a mistake and chosen to build something better from it rather than simply moving on. The platform stabilized completely within 6 weeks. The 2 engineers assigned to the knowledge transfer, a meticulous architect named James Park and a younger engineer named Sonia Reyes, who had an unusual talent for systems thinking, spent their days working through Daniel's documentation with the focus of people who understood what was at stake, and Daniel spent his 3 days a week working through it with them, explaining the reasoning behind decisions made years ago, unpacking the logic of code written in late-night sessions, whose context had never been recorded except in his own memory. It was slow work, and it was necessary work, and he did it with a patience that surprised people who had only known him as the man who slept at his desk. Occasionally, in the middle of a working session, he would close his eyes for a few minutes, 5, sometimes 10, and neither James nor Sonia acknowledged it, because they understood now what they were in the presence of and what those brief silences cost and sustained. The company's culture evolved in the ways that cultures evolve, when something large and visible has shifted not dramatically, not overnight, but in the accumulated small decisions of many people who had been rethinking what they thought they knew. Performance reviews began, including a new section. It asked managers to document not just what their team members produced, but the conditions under which they produced it. HR ran 2 workshops on identifying and accommodating non-apparent conditions. The language around professionalism became, quietly and without fanfare, more accurate, less focused on the visible markers of diligence, and more focused on the actual substance of contribution. Evelyn continued to be demanding. She continued to expect rigor and accountability and execution. She did not become less exacting. She became more precise. There is a difference. The meeting, approximately 8 months after Daniel's return, was a routine technical review mid-quarter system status. Nothing that required anyone's full concentration. James Park was presenting. Sonia Reyes was taking notes. Evelyn sat at the end of the table with a cup of green tea and a tablet she was using to review the following week's board materials. 12 minutes into the presentation, Daniel Hayes, seated in the 3rd row, the same approximate position, in a room that remembered everything, allowed his eyes to close and his breathing to slow, and his extraordinary, expensive, irreplaceable mind to rest for a few minutes in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. James Park noticed. He glanced at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Daniel for a moment. Then she looked at the room. Someone near the back was suppressing a smile. Someone else looked at the table with the corners of their mouth turned upward. Patricia Okafor, seated near the window, made no effort to hide anything and simply looked at Daniel with the quiet, uncomplicated affection of someone who knows the full cost of what they have been given. Evelyn set down her tea. She said, in a voice that was measured and even and contained something it had not always contained before, "Let him sleep." A pause. She said, "He's been awake for the rest of us for a very long time." The room was quiet, not the silence of shock or discomfort, but the silence of people who are in the presence of something they understand and who do not need to say anything about it. James Park nodded once and continued the presentation. Outside the east-facing window, the city went about its afternoon with its usual lack of ceremony, entirely indifferent to what had just been said in a conference room on the 7th floor. And inside that room, Daniel Hayes slept, and the work went on, and the building hummed quietly around all of them.